If you're still awake, there's probably a reason. This is Boring History Nights, where history doesn't speak loudly, but long enough to hush the dark. You didn't come here for answers, maybe not even for sleep, maybe just to be somewhere soft. Here, the stories don't push. They float like old parchment drifting in candlelight, slow enough to forget their purpose. The air doesn't move. Somewhere, a chair creaks, or maybe it's just your breath brushing the quiet. Dust lingers mid-fall, as if history paused. Whatever warmth you carried, it wouldn't have lasted the night. Let's not stretch this too fast. If something about this quiet spiral makes the night pass easier, you can subscribe, only if you'd want to hear the next one drift by. And, if you're still awake, say where the night found you. I read them all, even the ones that don't remember how they got here. Now let the dark stay dark. Let whatever follows arrive slowly, like it's always been here. You don't have to keep up. Just listen. This is Boring History Nights, and you're already inside it. There's a wooden door built into the outer wall of a stone chamber. It's too narrow to be anything grand, and too high to be a passage you'd walk through confidently. You'd notice it only if you stood by the wrong window, at the wrong angle, and asked why the stonework looked like it flinched. It doesn't lead to a room. Not really. It leads to an emptiness that the castle never speaks of and never seals. They called it the garderobe, a word that once meant wardrobe, not because it held fine garments, but because people believed the ammonia stench would keep moths away. It was a belief born of need, not science. And in castles, where space was limited and the wind was always looking for ways to enter, the garderobe became both a convenience and a humiliation dressed in stone. You reach for the rusted handle. It resists, then sighs. The door opens outward, not onto another room, but into nothing. A narrow ledge, just wide enough to sit. Beneath it a drop that may have once opened into the moat, or into a pit long lost to sediment and memory. Whatever it was, it isn't there now. Just the void. Just the hush of air pretending not to notice what's been done above it. There's a bench carved directly into the stone, smooth from centuries of reluctant visitors. A narrow slit beneath it. No decoration. No comfort. No curtain. It wasn't built for dignity. It was built for inevitability. You sit because eventually, everyone had to. Knights, queens, monks, cooks. The rain didn't care who they were. Neither did the ledge. They say that people would lean out and shout to others from their garderobes, waving and chatting as if nothing odd was happening. That they'd greet friends on the ground with a joke or a warning. But those were castles with courtyards, with laughter. This one is quiet, and no one is below. The stone is always cold, even in summer. It holds the temperature of old regrets. You lower yourself with care. It creaks slightly, not because the structure is weak, but because memory doesn't forget where people broke. There's no flush, no water, no privacy beyond what the wind steals for you. But there is stillness, the kind that only comes from something so old, so unapologetic, that it no longer pretends to improve. Beneath you, gravity handles what nobility refuses to mention. A straight drop into whatever the moat no longer swallows. If it lands on a stone, you'll know. If it doesn't, maybe someone else will. Some garderobes were built in pairs, 2 holes, side by side. Companionship in silence. Not because people wanted to speak, but because being alone while vulnerable is somehow worse than sharing a shame. In the winter, frost would climb the stone ledge before the sun even rose. Men hesitated. Women layered more skirts. Children were taught to go quickly and not to look down, because down meant stories, and stories meant trouble. You run your hand along the edge. There are marks, not carvings, not words, just scratches where fingers gripped during storms. or moments of sudden wind, or quiet thoughts they didn't want to finish. The smell is faint, but not gone. Time doesn't erase, it absorbs. The garderobe is part of the castle's bloodstream, now hidden in towers and high walls, like secrets pressed between pages never turned. In other rooms, people gather. They don't talk about this place. They talk about feasts and furs, about alliances and births, but somewhere, someone always glances at the wall and knows what's behind it and how close it always is. When siege came, the garderobe became both salvation and curse. To relieve yourself without leaving the chamber was a blessing. But when the enemy scaled the walls, it became a weakness. Some invaders climbed through the very shafts meant to carry waste. Some historians say it was through these very holes that betrayals entered. It makes you think about where safety begins and how thin its walls might be. Even now, the cold breeze wraps around your ankles. You shift slightly, aware of how exposed this space feels, and yet how essential it was. You're sitting in what once was shame and now is history. But to the people who built it, it was just another room, a necessary silence carved into stone. Maybe it was never about discomfort. Maybe it was about remembering humility even in towers. And as you stand, the wind swirls again, not loud, just present, like breath on the back of your neck, like a story waiting for someone to notice its ending. You close the small wooden door gently. It clicks into place, as if it never opened. But you know it did. You were there. You sat where lords once did, and where the castle still listens. Some things don't leave stains. They leave echoes. And this one hums softly, like a memory you didn't want, but now carry. You stay standing for a moment, just outside the door. The wooden handle still warm beneath your palm, as if it remembered every hand that ever reached for it in hesitation or relief. Behind you is a room pretending to be noble, filled with heavy tapestries and low firelight. Before you is the narrow ledge where the stone remembered things no tapestry could cover. And now, beneath your feet, somewhere beyond the cold masonry and wind-carved wall, there is only air and what gravity never gave back. They built garderobes like this on purpose, high in the wall, pressed into turrets, wedged above moats or cesspits that were supposed to cleanse by virtue of distance and denial. Privacy was never real in a castle. Only proximity changed, and even that was rarely your choice. So when you sat on one of those ledges, you didn't disappear from view. You just entered a silence that didn't know what else to say. In the blue hush of pre-dawn, the moat below isn't visible, but you can smell it, faintly. A tang of algae, old iron, and something sourer. Maybe vinegar, maybe time. It's not rotting, not yet, but it's never been fresh. And that's what most medieval toilets were, not separate rooms, but ideas that never quite worked. The shaft beneath this seat is angled just enough to pretend it's self-cleaning. It isn't. Builders believed that if the hole was high enough, the air would do the rest. Some added wooden chutes. Others lined the walls with lead. One castle even ran a narrow channel of water through the shaft in an attempt at dignity. But most simply let the waste fall, believing the wind would carry the shame away. It rarely did. You place a hand on the inner wall. The stone is smooth, curved inward from generations of touch and time. There's no writing here, no carvings, no graffiti of the kind found in Roman latrines or on public walls centuries later. This was not a space where people lingered. The architecture made sure of it. Cold air, no light, no handle on the inside. A room that encouraged quick decisions and quieter departures. Still, not all garderobes were built equal. In royal quarters, the shaft might empty into a hidden channel below. scraped out every few weeks by servants no one dared to name. In servant halls, the hole might open into nothing at all, just a dark pocket of air and stone, where the stench fermented like wine no one ever meant to drink. And for the prisoners, the condemned, the forgotten, they squatted above buckets or pits, hoping not to be forgotten long enough for the smell to disappear. It never did. Historians still debate whether these design choices were born from ignorance or hierarchy. Some say castles were fortresses first, homes second, and sanitation always last. Others argue that the placement of these medieval toilets said everything about how people valued status, who had access to distance, to airflow, to dignity, even while relieving themselves. There is a story about a bishop who refused to enter a castle until the privy was moved away from the chapel wall. He claimed he could hear sin drip through the stone. Maybe he was right. Not about sin, but about what seeps where. The wind rises. It moves through the shaft like breath through a reed pipe, long, steady, and unasked for. You can almost hear it play something. Not a tune, but a sound that feels like old confessions. You close your eyes and imagine who sat here before. A queen, perhaps, holding the edge of her gown in gloved hands, nose tilted upward in defiance of scent. Or a child, shivering, whispering to herself to go quickly, before the cold numbs the skin. Or a knight, armor half off, cursing softly as he steadied himself on the stone, all valor stripped by the body's simplest need. In that moment, they were the same. Titles dissolve when knees bend. The garderobe leveled them all. And yet, even within that leveling, hierarchy crept back in. Some garderobes had shelves, others had rags. The wealthiest might keep herbs near the seat, rosemary, lavender, sage to hold near the nose or stuff into the cracks. Some even believed certain scents warded off disease. Miasma theory hadn't yet given way to germ theory, but they knew enough to be afraid of smell. Below, the pit wasn't always a pit. In some castles, a cesspool stretched the width of the outer wall, a long, low channel that might be emptied once every season. Workers lowered themselves with ropes or ladders. They wore scarves soaked in wine or ash water, believing it would mask the scent. It didn't. They emerged half-drowned in muck, their names forgotten even faster than their service. The French called them vidangeurs. The English had no name at all, only silence. You lean forward, just slightly, to look down the shaft. It swallows light like ink. Nothing reflects, and yet you feel watched, not by eyes, but by the sheer depth of everything this stone has witnessed. Every drop, every pause, every breath held and released on this edge, it's still here, suspended in memory even after the body moved on. There's a superstition, rarely mentioned, that says the garderobe is a listening place. That stone can absorb secrets spoken while the body is unguarded. That castles remember best not where you stood proud, but where you sat exposed. Maybe that's why no one lingers. Somewhere, a pigeon coos. The sound bounces through the shaft oddly, echoing as if from a second mouth. You step back. The air shifts again. The breeze carries something different now, not a smell, not a sound, just weight, like something waiting to be admitted. You close the wooden door gently, let the latch settle back into the frame. Nothing clicks, but you feel it catch. The room behind you is warmer, dim. The fire has dulled to coals. The tapestry on the far wall moves faintly, stirred by the same wind that passed through the garderobe and into your thoughts. A flicker of movement by the hearth. A servant girl, arms full of kindling, eyes averted. She nods but doesn't speak. Perhaps she's come to clean, or perhaps to avoid using the same shaft you just left. They say that if you sat too long on a cold seat, it stole something from you. Heat, dignity, time. Some believed it drew sickness from the bones. Others claimed it made you forget things, names, promises, reasons you entered the room at all. What if they weren't wrong? And what if the cold stone beneath you wasn't passive? What if the garderobe wasn't just an architectural compromise but a mirror? Not one made of glass or silver, but of silence. A place where the body undid itself while the mind, briefly, admitted its truths. You don't remember the names of the masons who carved the shaft. You don't know the faces of the ones who emptied it. But the castle remembers. It remembers everything that passed through it, and not just the noble parts. When a place carries every release, every failure, every moment someone couldn't wait, it becomes something deeper than stone. It becomes witness. And now you are part of that witnessing, not because you chose to be, but because you paused and noticed. Some corners of the past don't reveal themselves with flags or titles. They wait, in silence, until someone walks past, then lingers, and remembers to look down. You haven't said much aloud, but something in your shoulders has already surrendered. The air in the room is warmer now, though that may only be comparison. A fire can feel generous after standing near the mouth of a shaft that whispers everything you wish you could forget. You step away, but not far. The memory of the ledge lingers like a bruise under the skin, not painful, but present. The bench carved into the wall wasn't cushioned. Of course not. You don't expect comfort from a space that never pretended to offer it. But still, the stone bears the imprint of those who came before, and you feel it even now, the way you can feel the shape of a name long erased from parchment. Not readable, but real. It wasn't just a place to go. It was a place you had to go. There's a difference. That distinction settles into your chest as you sit by the wall, nowhere near the shaft this time, but close enough to remember. The stone used for medieval toilets, these garderobe seats, was carefully chosen, not for softness, but for endurance. Builders needed something that would withstand centuries of use without warping, rotting, or flaking into the void below. And so they picked limestone, or slate, or rough granite, depending on what the land offered: practical, cold, eternal. There's a particular irony to that permanence. The body's most fleeting moments, recorded forever in material meant to last. No inscription could capture what these stones held, yet every surface hums with remembrance. Some castles tried to improve the experience. They lined the seat with wood. They added covers, like lids on cruel thrones, not to preserve modesty, but to discourage rats. Yes, rats. The creatures below knew the shaft well. In lean seasons, they climbed it. The warmer air from above drew them like ghosts to firelight. More than one child screamed at the sudden flicker of fur where relief should have been. That's why people began to place sprigs of mint near the seat, or ashes in a bowl, not as decoration, but as a kind of prayer, not the kind offered to God, but to whatever spirits kept rodents away. And perhaps, in doing so, they elevated the space slightly, made it into something more than just a hole in stone, a shrine to survival, to endurance, to the quiet art of living with discomfort without complaint. There was no candle in most garderobes. Light meant fire, and fire meant risk, especially near flammable fumes. Those who stepped in at night did so by memory or by faith. Some carried oil lamps shielded by tin. Others brought servants with torches, asking them to wait just outside the door. Imagine that, asking someone to hold flame while you unburden yourself. And they did, without question, without reward. This is where hierarchy softened, even if only slightly. Lords used the same ledge as squires, queens, the same shaft as chambermaids. What changed was the silence, the expectation of pretending it wasn't happening. The higher the rank, the quieter the shame. That was the real difference. Not the structure, but the pretending. You touch the side of the bench again, tracing the groove worn into the edge. It's not intentional, your hand just knows to look for texture, for story. The groove isn't deep, but it's there. Centuries of cloth brushing, of elbows resting, of fingers pressing while waiting for something to end. That's what it was, a waiting place. Not everything here was immediate. In times of illness, or age, or pregnancy, or fear, people sat longer. Sometimes they cried, sometimes they hummed, and sometimes they prayed not for salvation, but for the body to obey, to let go, to be done. You realize something. Then the garderobe wasn't merely about waste. It was about patience, about pause, about the fragile piece of bodies doing what they must, while the rest of the castle went on pretending it didn't exist. There's a tale passed quietly in one northern village about a lady who used to sit on the privy during storms, claiming she could hear the future through the shaft, that the wind, rushing up from below, carried more than cold, that it brought whispers from places too low to see and too old to name. Her family said she was mad, but the servants believed her. They began to leave small tokens on the ledge buttons, dried herbs, pebbles wrapped in cloth, hoping the shaft would carry them to someone listening. Historians dismissed the story, of course. They call it folklore, but the ledge was real, and the tokens were found. Sometimes truth hides in places too humble for attention. You shift slightly, imagining yourself as one of them, not the lady, but the servant who cleaned the bench after, who wiped the stone with vinegar and a strip of linen, not because they were ordered to, but because they couldn't bear to leave it untouched, who felt, perhaps, that if the stone stayed clean, something else might too. Reputation, grace, dignity. We forget how much of history was cleaned away, not by kings, but by hands no one recorded. When siege came, and the garderobes could no longer be used, when even the shaft became a threat, a weakness, a place where fire or invaders might climb, the people turned to buckets, and the buckets turned to corners, and dignity turned to necessity. Some say those were the hardest days, not because of hunger or bloodshed, but because privacy evaporated completely. There is something about relieving yourself in front of others that dissolves the last fragments of ceremony. Even silence cannot save you then. After the siege ended, many castles rebuilt their garderobes with more care. Some added curtains. Others changed the angle of the chute. A few even installed rudimentary drains, channels of water fed from rooftop cisterns. It wasn't plumbing, but it was thought. And thought, when given to waste, becomes something close to mercy. You rise now, slowly. The bench remains behind you, unmoved, unbothered, unconcerned. It doesn't need to care. It has already done its part, held, endured, witnessed. It's strange to feel gratitude toward stone, stranger still to feel kinship, but you do. Because this was never just about toilets, or hygiene, or even architecture. This was about what we choose to build into the edges of our lives. The quiet corners where shame and necessity meet, and neither one wins. Even now, as you leave the room and walk down the narrow hall, you carry that memory in the small of your back. Not pain, not embarrassment, just awareness. The castle is still sleeping. You are not, but something in you has quieted just enough. And maybe, just maybe, the bench felt it too. The hall narrows before it widens again. leading you down a set of stone steps, slick from age and the steady passage of boots. You descend slowly, your hand trailing the wall, each stone cool beneath your fingertips. The air here is different, heavier, not from rot or dampness, but from memory, the kind that gathers, not in grand events, but in the quiet, functional hours of forgotten people. These were not the garderobes of towers or walls. This was lower, warmer, closer to where life happened, and so too, where the body's humbler needs were met in less elevated fashion. In the dim corner of a sleeping chamber, tucked behind a curtain or half wall, a ceramic pot waits. It is glazed, chipped, and unremarkable, yet it once bore witness to more vulnerability than any throne. You lift the lid slowly, out of habit, though it holds nothing now. Still, a scent clings faintly to the rim, like a page not yet erased, the scent of something human, familiar, half embarrassment, half relief, the smell of sleep interrupted. Chamber pots were not conveniences, they were compromises. No one wanted them, but no one wanted the cold stone hallway at midnight either. In winter, when floors froze and wind scraped through cracks, the idea of walking across stone in the dark was unbearable. And so, people chose something nearer, a pot beneath the bed, a jug by the hearth, sometimes wrapped in cloth to muffle the sound, sometimes hidden in boxes that pretended to be stools or chairs. You wouldn't call it dignity, but it was something like it, an arrangement between necessity and shame. For women especially, this was both freedom and frustration. The chamber pot allowed some privacy, but only if no one else stirred, only if no servant came too early, only if the house slept deeply enough to forget that people needed such things. In castles, the lowest servants were often tasked with emptying these pots. At dawn, long before the noble residents stirred, they crept through corridors like shadows, each step careful, each movement trained by repetition and the understanding that spills meant consequences. They did not speak. They did not complain. They simply carried, pot after pot, down into the yards or refuse pits, into the cold earth or the stone chute that led to where no name dared go. Historians call it sanitation, but for those who lived it, it was something else, a ritual of silence, a burden carried without being seen, and sometimes that was the only thing people asked to not be seen. There is a poem anonymously scratched into the plaster wall of a village inn that reads, "I dreamed I flew, but woke to carry pots. So what is flight, if not forgetting? It's unsigned, faded, but someone wrote it while holding a jug they didn't want to carry, and somehow the castle still remembers." There's something childlike in the shame of needing a pot, that feeling of dependence, of not being able to hold it until morning, of waking and whispering to oneself that it's all right, that no one will know, and yet someone always did. The cleaner, the listener, the one who scrubbed the floor or carried the basin. Nothing in a castle stayed secret, not really. But some things were treated as if they deserved silence. This was one of them. You pass a small alcove where several pots are stacked, terracotta, glazed clay, tin, some with lids, others open like mouths too tired to close. The variety says something about class, about era, about how people tried to make discomfort feel less like punishment. The poor might share one pot among 5. The rich might have 2 in every room, but both would glance away when the time came to use it. In some places, lavender was sprinkled into the bottom. In others, ashes or dried mint leaves, not to clean, just to mask, to pretend that the body was more fragrant than it truly was. There is tenderness in that pretense. Even now, you can feel it the attempt to soften what cannot be denied. A young boy, half asleep, once dropped his family's only chamber pot down a stairwell. The sound echoed like thunder through stone corridors. He was punished, not because of the loss, but because he laughed. The laughter made the shame louder, and in castles, shame was allowed, but not when joyful. They told him not to smile while cleaning it up. They told him to remember that some things don't belong in sunlight. But how strange to be told that relief must always be accompanied by regret. You step outside, into a small courtyard where a drain runs down into a moss-choked pit. This is where the pots were poured, where the morning's burden became water again foul, forgotten, flowing downward through a crack in the world. The stones here are worn not from feet, but from hands, from tilting and emptying, from trying not to spill. This is not a place anyone names. No tapestry shows it. No herald draws a crest over it. But it was as much a part of castle life as the feast hall or the chapel. It's a strange kind of intimacy. The knowledge that every noble guest you admire once bent over a pot in the night. That every tapestry of a glorious figure on horseback conceals a human who once whispered in the dark, hoping no one else was awake to hear the sound of water in ceramic. Perhaps that's why this part of history was left out. Not because it was unimportant, but because it was too familiar. Too close to now, your feet press against the frost-kissed stones, and for a moment, you feel every hand that ever touched this corner, not in pain, not in guilt, just in quiet, just in need. There are fragments of straw here, caught in a crack near the drain, maybe from someone's shoe, maybe from the broom used to sweep away the morning. And then the image forms a woman in plain wool, bending at dawn, pouring gently, wiping with care, and rising with a sigh that no one ever asked about. Not because they didn't care, but because there were no words soft enough to name what she had done. You look back toward the door you came through. It remains open, just slightly, like a thought not quite closed. And maybe that's what these chamber pots truly are, not objects, but moments left unfinished, little vessels that held more than waste. They held vulnerability, fear, softness, life, as it truly is when no one is looking. And now you are looking, and you see them. The pot, the shame, the hands, all still here, waiting to be known gently. You remain in the courtyard a moment longer, letting the stones settle beneath your steps, and the early morning light peel itself slowly across the low walls. The air is colder now, not from the weather alone, but from what it carries, the echoes of scent. Not one, but many, braided through the centuries and layered like forgotten pages in a book no one finished reading. We speak of castles as stone and strength, of towers and banners, of feasts and iron gates. But if you stood still long enough as you're doing now, you'd find that the first thing a castle ever gave you was its smell. It began with ash from hearths lit in every room, from kitchens that burned meat and bread and spit polished bones over open flames all day, every day. The air hung thick with smoke that knew too many names and no rest. Even in the halls of kings, the air never tasted clean. It tasted of burnt wood, of overcooked roots, of wool singed from being too near the fire. There were no chimneys, not at first. Smoke curled along beams, settled into thatch or stone crevices, crept into tapestries where it lived for decades, and then quietly climbed into lungs when no one was looking. Castles didn't breathe. They coughed. But ash was only the beginning. Beneath it lay the deeper smells, the ones that arrived on boots and cloaks, in hair, in furs worn for too many winters. The scent of horses, not just sweat, but manure dried into leather tack. The tang of blood dried into mail. The grease of meat clung to fingernails. And under that, always. The faint rot of damp cloth that never fully dried. And in corners, especially the corners, no lord ever knelt to notice. There was mildew. It climbed the backs of wooden chests, softened the edges of rush mats, curled up from the places where water gathered after the storm and stayed just long enough to fester. No one complained aloud. Complaints smelled worse than mildew. You pass a side corridor now, narrow and low-beamed. The stones here are slick. Moss creeps along the joints. You can't tell if it's from old leaks or from hands brushing past century after century, bringing with them the residue of kitchens and privies, of open cuts and boiled wine, of days that never dried out entirely. Somewhere beyond that corridor is the kitchen, though you won't go there yet. Not because it is off limits, but because it's louder than you need right now. Kitchens held their own scent of onions, cut with iron blades, of stews that boiled for hours until the smell became memory, of smoke-dried meat and spilled brine and flour scattered like dust. But in this moment, the air is quieter. You are in a part of the castle where people walked not to be seen, but to disappear servants' passageways, open stone walks between great rooms and the walls that supported them. And here, another scent, the dry, sour aroma of old wool, blankets aired once a season, cloaks never truly washed, hangings that hung too long above the garderobe doorways, the smell of bodies woven into cloth. Once, during a feast, a visiting noblewoman fainted not from heat or wine, but from the smell that rose when dozens gathered in a hall too narrow for breath. No one blamed her. The heat of pressed bodies, the sweat of anxiety, the scent of meat, spilled drink, smoke, and unwashed velvet, it overcame many. A castle was a place of grandeur, but it was also a place of fermentation, of scent as structure, of rooms that built themselves out of what lingered. One chronicler wrote that the stables were not the worst smelling place in the fortress. It was the hall after dancing. The place where joy turned sour through repetition and closeness. And yet, no one stopped the dance. They held hands, despite it all, despite each other's skin. And then, below all of it, the scent of waste. Not loud, not overwhelming, but there, a low hum beneath the stronger notes. A reminder that all the chamber pots, the garderobes, the spilled buckets, the forgotten corners, they were never truly out of mind, just buried beneath layers of rosemary, of resin burned in pans, of beeswax candles meant to offer both light and denial. It is said that queens wore pomanders, not for beauty, but as shields, carved spheres of silver or ivory, filled with dried herbs, tied at the waist or worn around the neck. They breathed through them during processions, not because they were delicate, but because castles tested even the strongest. You step again, deeper into a storage chamber, where walls are lined with baskets of lavender. Not fresh, dried long ago. Their scent still clings, but weakly, overtaken by dust and the musty trace of past rodents. A lace of old spiderwebs fills the corners, where few dare sweep. In the center of the room sits a wooden box. Inside, crushed mint, once used to line the bottoms of boots or lay beneath bedding, not for healing, for masking. This room is a mask, the castle's quiet attempt to cleanse itself. It never truly works, because the smell isn't only of waste, or ash, or rot. It's of time, of people, of persistence. The odor of effort without reward, the faint, cloying smell of survival. There's something humbling about that. To know that beneath the polished wood of a lord's table lies stone stained by generations of laborers who scrubbed and boiled and wiped with vinegar rags. That behind every velvet curtain hung to impress. There was a wall still damp from the last rain, its mildew waiting to bloom again. And you standing here now are not immune to it. You are breathing the same air, scented by history, touched by everything that refused to vanish just because no one spoke of it. You lean against the wall, let your eyes close, and exhale. Even now, the ash still drifts. You can't see it, but it's there tucked into the folds of your sleeve, caught in your breath, a memory disguised as dust. And this is the truth most history books forget. Castles weren't cold just from stone. They were cold from the effort it took to pretend they didn't reek of themselves. Because they did. All of them. Some more than others. Some tried harder to hide it. But every stone that housed a king also housed the scent of what that king never bent to clean. It wasn't just ash. It was memory. It was everything they built and everything they left behind. The castle never truly woke all at once. It stirred in layers. The earliest sounds belonged to servants, not to trumpets or horns, but to the soft rhythm of bare feet against stone. The creak of wooden doors opened just enough to slip through, and the weight of water being carried before light had begun its stretch across the high windows. If the nobles rose with ceremony, the servants rose with silence, and so too did their burdens. You walk now along the lower edge of the keep, not in the open yard, but in the covered trench that shadows the inner walls, a space made not for glory, but for movement without being seen. It's where the refuse was hauled, the linen soaked, the pots rinsed and emptied. This was the artery of the castle's body, and the blood it carried was never sweet. You follow the path without needing to think. It curves like instinct. Ahead, you see the figure of a girl no more than 15, hunched over a wooden yoke balanced across her shoulders. On either end hang clay pots, sealed not with lids, but with damp cloth tied in knots. Her hands grip the edge of the yoke like it could float her above the scent, though she knows better. She moves slowly, not from exhaustion, though that's present too, but because haste would spill what she's been told not to speak of. This girl, like many before her, is a night soil servant, a bearer of what others could not bear to admit they left behind. Her name is not in the records, her face never etched into a tapestry, her footsteps never followed by a scribe or bard, but the castle rests on her labor, not metaphorically, physically. Without her, the garderobes would fill, the chambers would sour, the stone would begin to whisper its discontent. You step aside as she passes, though she does not see you. Her eyes are focused downward, not out of fear, but concentration. Each step is a negotiation between the slosh of liquid and the steadiness of breath, between the weight of the yoke and the weight of invisibility. Because in castles, those who cleaned the mess were expected to vanish with it. She disappears around a corner, and you follow, slowly tracing the route she has memorized, past the kitchens, where ovens still sleep, past the herb room, where dried bundles hang like blessings never spoken, and finally out into the refuse yard, a hollow carved into the outer wall of the curtain tower. Here, she pauses. She lowers the yoke, one pot at a time. She unties the cloth, pours, rinses, waits. There is no reward, only repetition. This is where the story slows, not for lack of motion, but because the burden here is too heavy to rush. Not the pots, but the silence. Historians still debate whether medieval toilets were more symbolic than practical, if the architecture of relief was also the architecture of suppression. And if that's true, then she and others like her carried not just waste, but the evidence of hierarchy itself. They carried the shame that others refused to hold, the physical proof that nobility was still bound to the body, no matter how many crowns they wore. You look around the yard. Its walls are lined with buckets, wooden, clay, metal. A broken bench sits in one corner, and beside it, a pile of ash that once served as cleanser, now clumped from rain. This is not a place of punishment, but it is a place where memory sinks. Another servant enters, older, this time. A man with hands so thickened by lye and lime that his knuckles have lost shape. He nods to the girl. They don't speak. They don't need to. Their movements match. He carries straw. She carries pot. He pours while she wipes. It is a dance, but not a graceful one. It is a rhythm shaped by necessity. And still, no one looks. The nobility above will wake soon. They will dress in furs, speak of hunting and poetry, of alliances and dreams. They will sit in chambers recently scrubbed. They will lean on windows that overlook the garden and wonder aloud why the air smells fresher this morning. They won't ask who washed the pots. The girl finishes her task. She rinses the inside of one jar with vinegar from a leather pouch, swirls it, pours it into the earth, not because anyone told her to, because she has learned the hard way what lingers if you don't. A gust of wind moves through the yard, catches the edge of a rag she has tucked at her waist. The cloth lifts slightly, then settles again. It smells faintly of lavender, though that may be your imagination. She lifts the yoke again. Her shoulders flinch, then steady, and she disappears down the corridor once more. You remain, because you can't not. Because to witness what she carries is to realize how much of history was borne by hands that never left ink behind. You walk now into a small alcove off the refuse yard, a place where the cleaners came to rest, if only briefly. It holds no fire, but someone has left a stool, and on the stool, a basin. Inside, rose water, muddied from use. The castle tried, in its way, to offer comfort. Rose water was rare a luxury, but for those who handled the worst, sometimes a drop was spared, not as payment, as apology, a whispered one. You dip your fingers into the basin. It is cold, the scent has faded, but it's there. A softness so faint it might only be memory. And suddenly, you remember the girl's face, not from recognition, but from understanding. She is the one who made it possible for the upper rooms to feel untouched, for the tapestries to smell only of wool and smoke, for the nobles to believe their bodies belonged to legend, not to function. And in that, she becomes the spine of the castle, unspoken, but central. The phrase medieval toilets feels far too modern for what you have seen. These weren't just fixtures. They were negotiations between class and body, between silence and labor, between dignity and what it cost others to preserve it. You leave the alcove. You pass the drain again. The wind moves differently now. The sun is higher, but the shadow lingers, not because the light has failed, but because the work never ends. And for the girl, and the man beside her, and the dozens who came before them, the burden was never just the pot. It was being asked to make the shame disappear without letting it touch anyone else. They did, but the stones remember. You move along the outer wall, where the stone begins to slope gently downward, and the smell of earth rises stronger than the air above. It's not the scent of soil freshly turned or rain sinking into moss. It's older than that, heavier, tinged with the faint bitterness of things that were never meant to be unearthed again. The moat curves before you, wide and low, its surface still and streaked with algae. Most people imagine moats as roaring defenses, rivers of fast water, glinting and deep, keeping invaders at bay with their wet jaws. But that was never true, or at least, not often. Moats were rarely fed by rivers. They were fed by runoff, by rain, and more often than not, by waste. The stone chute you saw in the garderobe, that narrow mouth carved into the castle wall, didn't end nowhere. It ended here, or somewhere near, into the moat, or the dry trench below it, depending on season, and what didn't splash simply sat. Stewed, sank. In the high summer, the moat turned thick. A slick skin formed over its surface, broken only by the ripple of frogs or the wind's sigh through bulrushes. But beneath that surface was a brew of centuries' human waste, rotting food, dead rodents, discarded cloth, blood from the butchery, soot from the fire pits, ashes of old torches, and sometimes more unthinkable things. And still, children played near its edge. Servants fetched water from it when the wells ran low. The dogs drank from it, and sometimes the chickens, and no one had the strength to stop them. You stand now at the edge. The grass grows sparse here, yellowed and soft underfoot. A low stone ledge, barely a hand high, marks the boundary, not enough to prevent a fall, just enough to pretend one was never meant to happen. In some castles, reeds were planted deliberately, not just for appearance, but to mask the smell and offer the illusion of purity. It didn't work. The reeds swayed prettily, but they whispered of decay. You remember reading that in times of siege, when every bucket of water became precious. The moat served dual purpose, to repel and to provide. It was an act of desperation, to boil water drawn from the very place that received what the body refused. And still, they drank. Historians still debate whether moats were ever meant to carry waste in the first place. Some argue it was accidental, a result of proximity, not intention. Others claim it was by design, a way to make the approach to the walls unbearable, not just because of arrows, but because of what might be underfoot. And there are a few who insist that it was symbolic that the castle, no matter how grand, chose to defecate on its own doorstep, just hidden well enough to deny it. You watch a single feather drift across the surface now, catching the light in a way that almost makes it beautiful. But even beauty here is filtered through stillness, through a surface that doesn't want to be broken. A child once fell into this moat. The record is faint, barely more than a margin note in a steward's ledger. She was playing with a ribbon, reaching for it. No one heard her splash. They only noticed the water move, and when they pulled her out, days later, they buried her near the refuse yard, where no one would have to pass her grave on the way to morning mass. This wasn't a place where prayers were kept. It was a place for what prayers couldn't fix. You crouch by the wall now, running your fingers along the stone. Some parts are smoother than others, worn by generations of hands lowering buckets, or by feet scrambling to retrieve a fallen tool. You feel, beneath the moss, the subtle indentation where water once trickled more freely. A drain, perhaps, or just the mark left by everything trying to leave. There's a moment here, in the hush, where the wind shifts and the surface of the moat flickers. You see not water, but memory, the kind that clings to a place long after its usefulness has passed. The moat is not angry, but it remembers. Not names, not faces, just weight, volume, descent. You walk slowly along its edge, following the curve. At a bend, the stone wall gives way to earth, and you find the remains of a wooden ramp now half rotted, overgrown with lichen. This, perhaps, was where carts once dumped refuse, where stable hands brought soiled straw, or kitchen boys emptied brine buckets too foul to keep. The moat wasn't just water. It was the final sentence to every story that had no ending elsewhere. The broken comb, the torn shoe, the chicken bones, the linens too stained to be cleaned again, the love letter burned and dropped from a tower window, the illegitimate child who never made it to morning. It sounds harsh, but this is what history forgets, that even castles had a stomach, and the moat was where it digested the rest. You pause to sit now, on a low stone where someone else surely sat before you. A cook, perhaps, catching her breath. Or a messenger who stopped to spit before the next climb. The stone is warm from the sun, and for a moment you don't think about the moat behind you. You just breathe. There's something profound about that. To sit in a place that was never meant to be admired, and find stillness in it anyway. Maybe because places like this aren't waiting to be seen. They just are. Honest in their foulness, patient in their function. A boy with a broken toe once sat here, refusing to go inside. He said the air out here, by the moat, smelled worse, but felt freer. That inside, everything was pretend polished, scrubbed, loud with lies. But here, the stench told the truth. He never left the castle, but he never stopped coming back to this wall. And somehow, the stone still hums with the shape of his presence. You rise again. The moat curves onward, disappearing beneath the bridge that leads to the outer ward. It will be forgotten soon by the guests arriving for the feast, by the nobles dressing for prayer. But you won't forget, because now you've seen it, not the water, but what it carried, and what it gave back. If your eyes are fading, let them. The story wasn't waiting for anyone. The wind was always supposed to carry it away. That was the hope, or at least the excuse, that whatever passed through the narrow shafts of stone, whatever emptied from the chamber pots into the trenches, whatever bled from the kitchens, the slaughterhouse, or the very mouths of the sick, would be borne elsewhere by the breeze. Castles, in their immovable permanence, placed their faith in movement in air that could enter, cleanse, and exit without needing to be thanked. But there were days when the wind simply didn't come. You find yourself walking the corridor that runs along the outer wall, a long, shadowed tunnel, with narrow slits cut into the stone, not for beauty, but for defense. They let light in, but not much. They let air through, but only when the air wanted to be there. On still days, the corridor felt like a lung that had forgotten how to breathe. This is where the smell lingered longest. The latrines were only one part of it, the obvious part, but the truth was deeper than any shaft. The scent came from lived bodies, from damp cloth that never dried, from furs hung too close to stew pots, from boots crusted in earth and manure, from wax that smoked but did not sweeten. On days when the breeze failed to sweep through, the corridors held it all like secrets no one had the strength to forget. You pass a bench now, set into the alcove of an arrow slit. It's worn smooth on the left side, as if one person, or many who leaned in the same direction, sat there often. Perhaps they waited for shifts to change, or perhaps they came for the view. There was a belief, whispered among lower servants, that if you sat long enough with your back to the wall, facing the wind, it would carry your worry with it, but only if the wind was present, and that was never guaranteed. Today, the air stands still. You step into a side room, small and nearly forgotten. The walls bear the marks of old moisture, not mildew exactly, but tide lines of time. This room once held barrels, maybe tools, maybe cloth. Now it holds only its own odor, the heavy tang of enclosed history, the kind that settles when no one enters for too long. You reach out, pull open a narrow window, one of the few that turns inward, and for a moment, you wait, expecting that instinctive rush of relief that comes when fresh air pours in. Nothing, not even a breath. The wind is elsewhere today, or worse, it is hiding. When that happened in the past, people noticed, more than they admitted. The cooks would throw more herbs into the fire, hoping to mask something they couldn't name. The ladies of the hall would press scented cloths to their mouths. The stable hands would laugh louder to drown the silence. And the ones who emptied the pots, they bore the worst of it. Because when the wind didn't come, their task didn't pause. They still carried the weight. They still poured. But the absence of air meant the work clung to their sleeves, to their skin, to the back of their throats. It followed them like a shadow, too stubborn to leave at the door. A record from a minor court in Anjou mentions a week in mid-July where the wind failed for days. The inner halls grew foul. The servants refused to eat in the lower chambers. One page collapsed from the heat and was dismissed for weakness. The head cook ordered all windows thrown open, but the air didn't move. The waste built up, the moat thickened, and still the nobles feasted, only commenting that the wine tasted duller than usual. That's how silence worked in castles, not just as an absence of noise, but as a refusal to name what was already known. You return now to the corridor. The light has shifted the slits, cast long shadows along the wall, slanted like time itself has begun to lean. And here, again, you feel it, the presence of something unmoving. It isn't threatening, but it isn't kind either. It is what happens when a space grows too used to its own scent. It forgets there is another way. And that's what scared them most. Not the rot, not the staleness, but the possibility that this stagnant air, this breathless hush might be the default, not the exception. You continue walking, past a series of doors half ajar. Some lead to storage, others to empty rooms that once held candles, ink, parchment, things that didn't rot in the usual way but aged all the same. You stop at one. It smells of wax and oil, and underneath that faint, almost imagined the memory of waste. Perhaps someone once hid a chamber pot here. Perhaps it spilled. Perhaps no one ever bothered to clean beneath the floorboards. There's a crack in the wood near your foot, a place where something was pried loose. You crouch, running your finger along the edge, and for a moment the scent sharpens. Not just human, but time-worn, like fabric stored too long beside something living. It brings to mind the days of plague, when the air itself was feared, and when people fled from rooms like this, hoping that distance alone could keep them clean. But distance couldn't cleanse the corridors, nor the silence left behind. Some scholars claim that castles weren't designed for comfort, but containment, that their walls held not just people and possessions, but smells, fears, sounds no one wanted to hear in the open. The castle became a vessel sealed from outside threats, but also from escape. And when the wind failed, there was no one left to carry it all away. You rise, brush your hand on your cloak. Though there is nothing visible there, still, the instinct remains. To shake off what clings, to step into air that might forgive. But the corridor is still. You walk again, slowly, feeling the weight of breath that doesn't refresh. You understand now what the servants knew, what the girl with the yoke never said, that sometimes even the stone holds its breath, and when it does, the body remembers. Just ahead, a larger window opens onto the courtyard. You move toward it, place both hands on the frame. You want the wind, even now, even knowing what it might bring. But the trees beyond do not sway. The flags atop the tower do not ripple. The moat lies still. The sky, pale and open, refuses to stir. And so you wait, not for air, but for something inside to exhale what has been held too long. Some nights are made of breath held too long. This is one of them. The tower rises before you now, not as a symbol of defense or conquest, but as something quieter and far more human. This is no great keep or bell tower, not the perch for archers or watchers of war, but a tower dedicated to function, one that housed a privy stacked on every level, each floor emptying into the same vertical shaft that ran like a wound through the spine of the stone. These were the privy towers, structures built into the walls or corner turrets, often overlooked in drawings of castles, barely mentioned in romantic retellings, and yet utterly essential to the rhythm of medieval life. They were narrow, multi-story veins of waste, each chamber's contents falling into a shared chute, sometimes flushing into a cesspit, other times directly into the moat, or, when poorly designed, into nowhere at all, collecting silently beneath the foundation like a buried confession. You step beneath the arch that frames the base of one such tower. The door is crooked, its hinges long rusted and complaining under the weight of time. Inside, the stone stair curves upward tightly, carved with the shallow dips of centuries of ascent and descent. It smells less now, not because it's clean, but because it's dry. Odor lingers longer in dampness. Here, the air is brittle. As you begin to climb, you notice how the walls grow narrower. The higher you rise, the more intimate the space becomes, until even your own breath begins to feel unwelcome. It's as though the tower doesn't wish to be entered again, but you press forward, hand against the wall, shoulder brushing stone. The first chamber you enter is little more than a closet, a bench with a circular hole, a narrow slit of light cut through the wall, and nothing else. No candles, no decoration, no attempt to soften what was done here. A hole in stone, a shaft beneath it, silence above and below. What surprises you is not the space itself, but how open it feels to the world beyond. The slit in the wall, intended for air and perhaps a glimpse of sky, also invites the suggestion of being seen. This was meant to be a place of privacy, and yet, standing here, you feel exposed. It was a paradox built into the very structure of medieval castles, the need to relieve oneself in solitude, countered by the architecture's unyielding demand for practicality. Doors were thin, locks were rare, walls were shared, and in towers like this, even the act of sitting carried with it the knowledge that someone could be walking below or above, hearing the echo, catching the scent, holding the silence differently. The nobility were not immune to this. Even queens had garderobes built into their chambers, sometimes lined with cloth, sometimes placed at the edge of a private balcony, elevated and ornamented, perhaps, but still open to the wind and, by extension, to the world. There's a record from a northern castle where a lady's privy opened directly over the path to the stables. She used it daily, believing herself unseen, until a stable boy was caught laughing beneath the window. He was whipped, not for rudeness, but for acknowledging what was supposed to remain invisible. That was the unspoken rule. Not that you could not hear or see, but that you must pretend you didn't. You step carefully into the next level up. The chamber is slightly larger, the bench more worn, the hole still carved with precision. Someone sat here often. Perhaps it was the steward, whose duties were many and whose relief was squeezed between errands. Perhaps a clerk, who came here to escape not just the body's demands, but the weight of watching others. In a castle, the act of being unseen was a rare gift. And even in the most vulnerable spaces like the privy, people sought invisibility not for shame, but for peace. To sit alone, in a room where no one would ask for decisions or favors, where no law needed reading, where no family demanded presence, was perhaps the closest thing to freedom a court official ever knew. And yet, even here, the eyes remained. Not literal, perhaps, but suggested. The shaft ran down through multiple floors. What fell from above could be heard from below. And when the tower was full, and some towers were rarely cleaned, the contents rose slowly, like a dark tide. It was said that during heavy rains, the lower garderobes gurgled ominously. People learned to avoid them on such days, You pause on the landing between levels. There's a small etching in the stone, so faint it almost vanishes in shadow. It's a shape, perhaps a star, or a sun, or a badly drawn wheel. Beneath it, a few letters scratched in haste. No full name, just a mark. Perhaps someone left it as proof they were here, or as a ward, a way of saying this space held me, even when I had nothing left. You climb again. At the top of the tower, the final chamber is wider, with a window facing outward, not a slit, but a true opening. It frames the forest beyond the castle walls, where birds flit through the branches and the light dances in ways that feel distant, unreal. This is where someone once came not only to relieve the body, but perhaps also to look away from everything else. There's a story half remembered, but often told about a lord who used the highest garderobe in the keep. He claimed he could think better there, that the wind cleared his mind as it did the rest of him. His wife called it foolishness. His squire called it devotion. His enemies called it a weakness. He died in that chamber, not from sickness, but from a fall. The ledge cracked beneath him, softened by years of moisture and neglect. He tumbled from his seat, robes tangled, dignity unwitnessed. And that, too, became part of the tower's silence. Because the privy was not only a place of vulnerability, it was a place of risk. Floors could rot, stone could shift, rats could bite, illness could rise from the very breath inside. And in towers like these, where waste was concentrated and left to ferment, the danger was real. In times of plague, many believed the disease traveled through such shafts carried on smell, on air, on whispers rising from the unseen depths. People blocked the holes with cloth, burned herbs inside, prayed beside the bench as though it were an altar. But the sickness came anyway. You stand now at the highest opening, the wind finally finding its way back through the stone. It brushes your face gently, almost kindly. And for a moment, you understand what the Lord meant, that to sit here, above the world, the air against your skin, the castle far below, was to forget that what you were doing was mundane. It became something else, a form of quiet detachment. Still, even here, you are not alone. You feel the weight of every gaze that passed through this tower, every glance that was averted, every breath that held itself politely, every step taken quickly, every conversation paused. Because the truth is, in castles, privacy was always conditional. You turn now, descending slowly. The stone stair echoes again, not with noise, but with thought, as though every step calls back the memory of those who once climbed up, sat quietly, left what they had to leave, and descended without a word. You leave the tower. The light has changed. Evening leans into the courtyard. You do not smell the waste anymore, but you remember how it shaped the walls. In all the talk of castles, their walls, their fires, their lords and betrayals, there is one truth few allow themselves to consider plainly after the act. After the squat or sit or crouch above stone or pot or earth, there remains the question of how one made themselves clean again. It is, in the modern mind, a whisper of a thought. But in the medieval world, it was a certainty no one escaped. You walk now through a side corridor that leads from the main hall to the smaller, narrower servants' wing. Along this passage, the air changes not because the breeze returns, but because the space narrows in a way that requires attention. This part of the castle was not built for display. It was built for management of people, of waste, of tasks that didn't fit the story told at feasts. You pass a room used for laundry, or what passed for it. Stone basins line the walls, stained from herbs and ash soap, their edges chipped by decades of heavy buckets and uncareful elbows. Ropes still hang from iron rings in the ceiling, frayed from the weight of wet linen. Among the stacks of cloth, the worn, the torn, the too stained for sheets but too soft to throw away, you begin to understand the reality of how castles managed what was left behind. The wealthiest nobles, when nature called, had access to cloth. Not fresh linen, not always, but cloth nonetheless, squares torn from old undershirts, worn chemises, the soft inner folds of tunics no longer fit to wear. These rags, rinsed and reused, were called clouts, and in the darkness of the garderobe, someone would reach for one without looking, wipe, and drop it down the shaft or into a bucket to be washed, or, depending on their mood or station, burned. And if you were poor, you reached for what was nearby: leaves, if the season allowed, dried grass in summer, hay or straw in winter, moss, if you were lucky, snow, if you were brave. And if you had nothing at all, then perhaps the hem of your garment, tugged down and hidden, rinsed at a later time in the stream where no one watched. There are records rare and brief of castles keeping bundles of wool trimmings in the latrines. Sheep's fleece, pressed flat, used gently, then discarded. It was soft, but dangerous. Unsanitary by modern standards, prone to infection. Yet when the skin burned, what mattered most was softness. You turn into another chamber now, a former storage room, half collapsed on one side, open to the gray sky above. Vines curl through the break in the stone, reaching down toward the cracked floor. A leaf flutters from one, broad and smooth, not unlike what someone centuries ago might have reached for in desperation or routine. Here, in this quiet space, the myth of medieval elegance crumbles further. The castle may hold paintings and pageantry, but it also held the daily confrontation with the body's demands and the blunt tools used to meet them. A knight, wrapped in armor, might command respect in the hall, but even he would sit in the cold and reach for a handful of hay. A queen, draped in velvet and pearls, might blush at the thought, but her attendants knew which linen pile held the softer clouts, and children, who didn't yet know shame, asked aloud which leaves were safe and which ones stung. There's an old story, perhaps apocryphal, perhaps not, of a noble woman who demanded that rose petals be placed beside her seat, not to wipe with, but to hold to her nose while she used the clout. The petals wilted quickly. The servants learned to replace them twice daily. Eventually, the woman claimed the scent of roses made her ill. That's how distance from reality works. The more you try to perfume it, the closer it grows to your skin. You crouch now beside a small hearth at the back of the chamber. The ashes are long cold, but within them are flecks of cloth, curled and blackened. Someone burned waste here not recently, but repeatedly. A small act of dignity, of trying to remove something from the cycle. Not everything was thrown into the moat. Some things were set alight, watched as they turned to smoke, given permission to vanish. And perhaps there's comfort in that even in a world where so little was private, there were still places to put things one did not wish to carry. But not everyone had fire. Not everyone had cloth. In many homes, not even castles, but cottages on the edge of the outer bailey, people used what the animals wouldn't eat, cleaned themselves with bark if necessary, with scraps of linen so thin they tore midwipe, with stones, worn smooth from riverbeds, rinsed and reused until lost or too bloodied to touch again. And yes, sometimes fingers were used washed later in vinegar or not at all. These facts are rarely spoken aloud, not because they are disgusting, but because they are uncomfortable, because they remind us that history isn't about victories or bloodlines. It's about how people lived in bodies that refused to wait for ceremony. You stand again. A breeze passes through the broken ceiling, stirs the leaves at your feet. For a moment, it smells of pine, then of dust, then of nothing. You leave the room, stepping back into the corridor. The light outside has shifted. You hear voices now faint, rising from the direction of the great hall. The castle is waking again. And soon, someone will enter the garderobe. Someone will squat or sit, reach for a clout or a clump of straw, do what must be done, and leave without speaking of it. Because that was the rule, not to forget, but not to name. If anything in this stayed behind, you can leave something below, or not. It still counts. This was Boring History Nights. There were few names more whispered and more quickly forgotten than that of the one who carried the castle's night soil. They were known in different tongues across the land: vidangeur, gong farmer, scavenger of ditches. In truth, they were not farmers, and they did not scavenge. They removed what the world refused to face. They walked paths no one else dared walk, often before dawn, with a yoke across their shoulders and a burden at either side that no one thanked them for carrying. You move now through the lowest part of the keep, beneath even the kitchens, beneath the cellars, through the arch that leads to the vault where barrels were once stored and forgotten. The air thickens here, not because it is foul, but because it is heavy with disuse, the kind of weight that collects where people once worked without witness. Here, the stone changes. It is darker, slicker, worn not by noble boots, but by the feet of laborers whose tasks were too urgent for delay, too mundane for song. The wall bears soot marks, though no torches burn. It was never meant to be seen in celebration. It was simply meant to be used like the man you now begin to imagine. He would have walked this same path, sometime between the last extinguishing of torches and the first cry of cockcrow. Before the castle rose into its daily rituals, before voices filled the kitchens, before fabric rustled in hallways or pages flipped in the chapel, he walked in silence and with great care. 2 buckets hung from the ends of his yoke, sometimes made of oak, sometimes leather, lined, if he was lucky, with cloth soaked in vinegar. The stench was not something that could be eliminated, but it could be shaped, redirected, outward, away. His task was not merely to collect. It was to empty, to pour, to return the vessel clean and upright, and then to disappear again. He was not to speak, not to wait, not to meet anyone's eyes. The only sound he was permitted to make was the one his wooden shoes made on the stone, a soft, scraping rhythm, like time pulling a cart behind it. You imagine his back, bent beneath the weight, not just of the buckets, but of knowing that his presence in the corridor meant something unpleasant was near, that his labor was necessary, but his face was not. He could be recognized by scent alone, no introduction needed. In wealthier castles, the keeper of the night soil worked from outside, entering only through lower service doors, never permitted to cross the threshold into hallways walked by nobility. He received his instructions by token, not word. A clay disc, placed in a basket, signaled a bucket needed changing. A colored cloth beside the garderobe door marked the chamber ready for cleaning. But in smaller strongholds and most castles were smaller than we imagined the keeper lived inside. Not in a room, but in a space carved behind the scullery, beside the root cellar, where the air was always damp and the walls always wept with condensation. His chamber had no fire, no window, only a basin and a board, and a hook, from which he hung his outer tunic, the one he wore only while working, and never brought back inside. He was paid, sometimes generously, more than the kitchen boy, more than the laundress, because no one else wanted his task. But money does not clean the hands, nor does it erase the looks. And yet he endured. because every castle needed one. Without him, the shafts clogged, the garderobes backed up, the stench crept higher into the chambers. Rats followed, illness settled. The servants stopped sleeping, the lord's meals were served cold, and the priest, in his fine vestments, began to cough. It took only 3 days of no night soil removal for a castle to begin to rot from the inside, so he was allowed to continue, quietly. There's an entry in an old inventory, not a journal, not a letter, just a list of things held in the undercroft barrels of salted fish, sacks of barley, 3 wooden shovels, and the cloak of the night bucket man. No name, just the object, preserved for when it would be needed again. You walk deeper now, through a passage that tilts downward, leading to what was once the cesspit. It is dry now, or dry enough the moisture absorbed by time, but you see the stone lip where buckets were tipped, the discoloration on the wall from years of fluid seeping, spilling, staining. It is not grotesque. It is simply real. There are marks in the wall, scratched lines, not writing, not images, just tallies. Perhaps he made them. Perhaps someone else did. A count of visits, a way to measure time, or maybe nothing more than the idle movement of a hand that had held too much. You crouch. The floor is uneven, pebbled with remnants that look like bone, though they are likely wood softened, lightened, hollow. The remains of handles, of tools long broken and swept into corners. You sit on the edge of the ledge and feel the gravity of the place, not from the pit itself, but from the fact that someone came here every day while others slept and did what was needed and left before light could make it real. This was not punishment, it was duty, and in that, there is a strange kind of dignity, because to carry what others discard is to know their most human truth. He knew which rooms smelled worse in summer, which guests left more than they took, which nobles never once acknowledged that someone returned the bucket they used the night before. And perhaps that knowledge gave him power, not the power to command, but the power to endure. In time, his hands became cracked, his knees stiff. The cloak stiffened in winter, sometimes freezing between shifts. His breath, on cold mornings, curled into the same air that carried the rest of the castle's hidden truths. There's a legend whispered in some kitchens of a night soil man who once overheard a secret, a meeting between lovers, held in a chamber where no one thought anyone would pass. He was there, emptying the pot. They didn't see him, or they didn't care. He listened, then left. The next week, the lover vanished. Some say he told, others say he warned. The story changes depending on who speaks it. But either way, he was there, and no one could deny it. Because the one who carries the waste carries the weight of everything no one wants to name. You rise now, step back into the corridor. The air is lighter, not because the scent has left, but because your breath has adjusted. It is always like that. When the truth settles, it no longer stings. It simply stays. You reach the top of the stairs, and for a moment, turn back, not to descend again, but to remember that someone once walked this path every day, carrying what others left behind, and made the castle livable, not from the walls, but from the waste. If you've started slipping out of it, keep going. The past barely noticed you were here. The stones beneath your feet no longer feel entirely solid. They still hold, still anchor the weight of all that rests above them. But something in their silence now feels less like stillness, and more like something waiting, not malevolent, necessarily just watchful, as if beneath the carved corridors and storied chambers of the castle, there lies another place entirely, made not of memory or architecture, but of instinct, a space not designed, but accepted, lived in, survived. You are in the undercroft again, not the lowest pit, not the visible place where buckets were upturned or barrels sealed with pitch, but the in-between layer, the crawl space of stone and damp wood, built where no one walked unless forced. There's no torchlight here, only the dull glow of what little daylight filters down through narrow wall slits, refracted in odd ways by the contours of the stone. Your breath comes slower now, not from fear, but from attention, because you've begun to hear something. Scratching. It is faint, then it pauses, then it comes again. At first, you think it is in the wall, but then, as your ear tilts toward the floor, you realize it is not so much in the stone as beneath it. There are holes here, not large, just wide enough for a curled palm or a rat's shoulder, carved into the space where the base of the wall meets the ground, where years of waste, dropped coins, and mouse-burrowed bedding have softened the line between construction and intrusion. These holes were not planned. They emerged. Or perhaps they were permitted, because castles, no matter how solid they appeared from a distance, were never entirely sealed. Time made certain of that. So did hunger. Rats lived here, not occasionally, not by accident. They were part of the structure, in the same way that soot lined the beams and damp curled the corners of every cloth. They were not guests. They were residents, and they knew more about the castle than anyone wearing a crest ever did. You step carefully now, avoiding a pile of dried straw that has clearly been nested in something once lay here, perhaps still does. The droppings are not fresh, but not ancient either. A midden of fur and gnawed wood lies in the corner, bits of parchment, a bone, too clean to be from the kitchen, a scrap of wax, everything chewed, everything repurposed. It is tempting to imagine this world as separate from the castle, as though there was one place above for people, and another below for vermin. But that line was never real. Rats traveled the same stairwells, crept beneath the same doors. They understood the shafts of the garderobes better than the architects who carved them. They followed warmth, scent, and silence, and they were rarely disappointed. There are records, some buried in the margins of manorial rolls, that describe infestations so large they altered routines. Children were forbidden from sleeping near the pantry. Cats were released and never returned. One lord built an entire false floor above the granary, so that the grain could rest untouched for a few days longer. It didn't work. The rats came anyway. Some claimed they climbed up through the toilets. Not legend, not fear, but fact. The vertical shafts, garderobes, privy towers, drainage chutes all served as perfect ladders for the creatures below. The scent drew them upward. The warmth did the rest. And so it was not unheard of for someone seated in the stillness of early morning to feel a sudden flicker against their calf, a sharp nip, or the whisper of movement beneath the bench. What followed was rarely reported, but it was never forgotten. You run your hand along the wall now, fingers tracing the edge of one such hole. It is smooth at the lip, worn down from time, not tools. Something has passed through this space often enough to make the stone forget it was ever meant to be a boundary. And here, perhaps, lies the true metaphor of medieval waste. It was never where it was supposed to be. It always moved, changed shape, found new ways to return. A rat's path is not unlike memory. It curls through the hidden places. It emerges when least convenient. It clutches what we drop, whether we meant to lose it or not. You step farther in, ducking beneath a beam whose underside is claw-marked. There's more than one trail here, more than one kind of creature. The larger prints are canine, a hound perhaps, once loose to hunt the vermin. The size suggests it did not return often, or it chose not to stay. And then, In a darker corner, you find what you didn't expect. A boot, old, stiffened by mildew, the leather shriveled, half buried beneath straw and dust, and near it, a flask, stoppered but empty, a cloth folded into a square and tied at the edge, as though once meant to serve as a pillow. Someone slept here, not long, not comfortably, but enough to leave an imprint, perhaps a runaway boy, perhaps a servant too shamed to return to her chamber after an accident, perhaps the night soil man himself, too weary to climb back to the scullery before the sun. They came here, into the same crawl space that rats claimed, and curled into the silence, perhaps even found comfort in it. Because silence doesn't judge, and stone, for all its coldness, is less cruel than people. You sit for a moment, knees tucked to your chest, your back against the wall. It's not comfortable, but it isn't terrible either. You understand why someone might choose it for the dark, for the quiet, for the absence of questions. Above you, faintly, a sound, a bench creaking, a door closing. Perhaps someone has entered the garderobe. Perhaps someone has left it. Their feet move slowly, a floor above yours, and the weight of their presence carries down the shaft. The rats, for now, are silent, but they're still here. You can feel them. Not malevolent, just alive, just waiting. And somehow, in this moment, you are not afraid of them. They are not the villains in this story. They are the inheritors, the ones who lived in the holes people left behind, the ones who did not ask for permission, only space. In a castle built for the display of human triumph banners, crests, armor polished until it gleamed, the rats knew where truth lived, not in the throne, but in the shaft below it. You rise, brushing straw from your sleeve. The air smells like old oil, stale breath, and the faint sweetness of dried herbs stored too close to decay. It is not foul, it is not fragrant, it is simply what remains. You make your way back to the stairs, your eyes adjusting now to the gloom, your breath no longer catching in your throat. You are no longer descending, you are returning. Above, the castle waits, but now you've seen what lives beneath it. Not ghosts, not demons, not myth, just rats, and the quiet they kept. The feast had ended hours ago, but the remnants still clung to the air. The wax from the tapers had thickened on the table edges, cooled into soft ridges like spilled milk forgotten in the dark. The bread had gone crusted. The platters carried away were licked clean only in places, the rest scraped off into wooden bins and cast to the dogs. Someone had sung near the end, and someone else had wept. The laughter was already fading, but what remained most clearly, even now, was the weight of too much meat, too much wine, and a question too delicate to ask aloud in company. Where, exactly, should a guest relieve himself in a castle not his own? You walk now through the corridor that leads from the great hall toward the outer chambers, a path well worn by boots polished with care and cloaks dusted with pride. The corridor itself is not large, but wide enough for two people to walk abreast, noble and host, knight and priest, or lady and servant, all pretending not to glance at the narrow doors built quietly into the stone along one side. These doors were not marked, but everyone knew. Guests, especially those of high standing, were afforded privacy, but not too much. No one trusted a stranger with solitude. Not fully. And so, the guest privy was positioned deliberately near high traffic areas, not to shame, but to remind. You may dine with us, laugh with us, drink with us, but your body still kneels here, behind this door, above that shaft. No title shields you from digestion. You pause at one such door now, hand resting on the worn iron latch. The wood is darker than the stone, aged from touch and weather, and the repeated entry of those who came with bellies full and thoughts cloudy with drink. You push the door open slowly. It swings wide without protest. Inside, the chamber is small, square, and undecorated. A bench, of course fitted with a carved opening, a shelf built into the wall, lined with faded cloths and a small jar, once filled with something sweet-smelling, now dry and forgotten, and in the corner, a window slit not for air, but for appearances. The guest would enter here not with curiosity, but with caution. For all their confidence in the hall, here they became uncertain again. The foreignness of another man's castle weighed more heavily in these moments than at any banquet. There was always the fear of using the wrong rag, of sitting too long, of being overheard, of emerging to find someone waiting. One record tells of a noble from the eastern counties who, upon misjudging the location of the guest privy, accidentally wandered into a storage chamber and used a barrel of barley instead. His apology was formal, his embarrassment eternal. His hosts did not invite him again, because the act itself was not shameful, but the failure to know how and where to perform it was. Etiquette manuals from the late 13th century include veiled references to privy behavior. A man of refinement, they suggested, should relieve himself with discretion, in silence, and without interruption. He should carry a cloth. He should not speak while seated. He should return looking as if nothing had occurred. But the truth was rarely so neat. Feasts in winter stretched into the long hours of the night. Food was rich, heavy, unfamiliar. Spiced meats, thick stews, rare fruits soaked in syrup, wine that clouded thought and loosened tongues, laughter louder than digestion. And by the time guests found their way to the narrow hallway outside the hall, they were rarely steady on their feet and often in need. You step farther into the chamber now. The seat is worn in the center, polished by bodies once wrapped in silk, velvet, or fur. Some came here alone. Others were guided by servants who waited just beyond the door. There are scratch marks near the edge of the bench, not from panic, but from stability. A hand searching for something to press against in the final moment of control. You see it all. The lord who entered with dignity but left with damp eyes. The widow who wept in the stillness, not from pain, but from memory. The child who could not hold it, and whose nurse spent the rest of the evening cleaning rags in silence. These were not grand stories, but they were real, because even in celebration, the body did not forget itself. It waited, patiently, through the speeches, through the dancing, through the game of dice played too long after the hall had cooled. It waited for the moment when the laughter quieted and the man, no longer a guest but simply human again, stumbled toward this door. There is a warmth in that, oddly, a kind of democracy. In the eyes of digestion, all are equal. You reach for the jar on the shelf. Inside, a trace of dried petals remains lavender, crushed into dust. The jar was not placed here for show. It was once an attempt at grace, a host's kindness, a small mercy to the traveler who came far and ate too much. And then, below the shaft, it descends farther than it appears. Beneath the stone, the waste of guests mingled with that of residents, servants, animals, and time itself. The moat was not discerning, nor was the pit. They received what was given, and never gave it back. There is something strangely intimate in knowing that beneath your feet lies the end of every toast, every boast, every stolen glance across the table. It all came here, and then it left, or stayed, depending on the wind. You sit for a moment on the bench, not because you need to, but because you want to understand. The room is quiet. No one knocks. No one laughs outside. You imagine a man of rank recently arrived, unsure of his welcome, seated here, eyes cast downward, robe gathered carefully to one side, clutching the cloth he brought from home, hoping the herbs would mask what the body insisted upon revealing. He would sit silently. He would finish quietly. He would rise with effort. And before leaving, he would pause not from embarrassment, but from humility. Because to be a guest in someone else's castle meant more than accepting their bread. It meant entering their silence, sharing their shaft, trusting their stones not to crack beneath you. You stand now, open the door, and step once again into the corridor. The light has shifted. A breeze passes through, stirring the edges of the tapestries. Somewhere, voices rise again, a new feast beginning, new guests arriving. And someone, perhaps soon, will ask the question they cannot speak aloud. Where do I go when I have to go? And the castle, without saying a word, will show them. They never spoke of him by name, not in the kitchens, not in the hall, not even in the stillness of evening, when whispers travel farther than they should. The story was known, carried in looks, in silences, in the way a certain corridor was swept more often than necessary. But no one used his name anymore, not even the steward who had once patted his hair when passing, or the maid who saved him bits of apple peel from the midday meal. Perhaps they'd forgotten it. More likely, they'd chosen to forget. Because some accidents are too ordinary to grieve properly, and too quiet to ever truly vanish. You've come now to a chamber tucked just past the nursery level. It is smaller than the others, low-ceilinged, cold in the corners. The air smells faintly of iron and lime, an old attempt to cleanse what time itself could not. There are no markings on the door, but you know this was once a privy for the children's floor. You've read the ledgers, skimmed the margins where caretakers noted linen used, candles burned, jars of dried lavender replaced. The entry for late autumn, 15 years ago, is different. It simply reads, "One cloth ruined, wall scrubbed. No need to summon father." You press the door open slowly. The chamber is still. A thin layer of dust has crept over the stone bench, unbroken by use. A mouse has made a soft nest in one corner, lined with bits of fiber and the curled edge of an old rag. The opening in the seat remains dark, circular, wide enough for a child's leg, and that is where your gaze stops. Because you've heard the version that the maids share in winter, when the snow presses in and the wind rattles the shutters, when the youngest children are asleep and the older ones ask about the past. There's always one who dares to bring it up. Did someone fall into the shaft? And there's always an older girl, arms folded across her apron, who answers too quickly, "No, that's just a tale." Then a pause, then a quieter voice. "But there was a boy, once, long ago. He was not supposed to be there alone. Children rarely were. The garderobe was cold, the floor uneven. Small bodies required supervision, a hand at the elbow, a steady voice. But it was late. The nursemaid had been pulled away, a fire downstairs, a scream from the scullery. The boy had eaten too much the night before, and woke with the urgency of a full belly, and no one nearby to guide him. He crept quietly. He'd been shown the way before. He remembered the latch, the creak of the door, the rush of air rising from the shaft below, the cool seat against his legs, the way the light from the small slit window never reached the bottom. But something happened that morning. No one knows whether he slipped, or leaned too far, or reached down to retrieve a cloth dropped by another child. Perhaps he lost balance. Perhaps he was dizzy. Perhaps he simply forgot, as children do, that the world could hurt them. He disappeared without a sound. By the time the nursemaid returned, the chamber was empty, the bench bare, the air still. She called for him, panicked at first, then frantically. Others joined. The courtyard was searched, the well, the garden walls. It was hours before someone opened the privy door, looked down, and understood. They did not recover him whole. There are no ballads written about children lost to shafts, no elegies sung for accidents hidden behind castle walls. But this one lingered, not in words, but in quiet refusals. No children alone near the south corridor, no games played near the privy steps, no candles burned too low. A carpenter was summoned to nail the door shut. He came at dusk, carrying fresh timber, square nails, and a face too tired to question the task. He saw the cloth still on the shelf, the jar overturned, the mouse in the corner, and he worked quickly. For a time, no one entered the chamber. Years passed. The bench remained. The shaft below it filled slowly with time. Stone settled. Moss climbed the outer walls, and the story faded into suggestion, a shadow told at arm's length, a lesson without a sermon. But you're here now, and it is no longer shadow. You kneel by the bench, tracing the edge of the opening. There are still grooves in the stone finger marks, maybe a child's palm pressed against the edge, either on the way down or reaching back up. You don't know which is worse. In the silence, your own breath sounds too loud. It's not fear that rises in you. It's not sorrow either. It's something smaller, sadder. The knowledge that the body forgets, but the stone never does. That beneath all our structure, our design, our dignity, we build places where people are lost and pretend they are only passageways. You look to the small window slit. The light coming through it is soft now, evening gold brushing the wall in a perfect diagonal line. Dust swirls in the beam, and for a moment, the chamber seems almost beautiful, peaceful, until you remember why it's been silent so long. There's a faint sound, not a voice, not movement, just the wind outside, caught in the stairwell, but it makes the bench groan ever so slightly, like something shifting in memory. You rise. There's nothing left to touch, nothing left to take. But the boy nameless, unspoken remains. Not in the shaft, not in the dust, but in the way everyone who passes this hallway steps quietly, never lingers, never asks. You close the door softly behind you. Outside, life continues. A bell rings for the evening meal. A child laughs somewhere above, chasing someone down the corridor. The floor trembles faintly with footfalls, but they move on, upward, away. Only you remain at the landing. You look back once more. The door is simple wood, no carvings, no sign. But for the rest of your time in this castle, you will always know there was a child who slipped, and the castle, in its stillness, remembered him. You think of the castle from above, the flags waving proudly, the archers walking the battlements, the lords dictating letters in rooms of stone and tapestry. And you think of it from within music in the halls, footsteps on worn stairs, voices echoing off carved beams. That is the castle most remember. That is the castle they celebrate in stories. But the truth of the castle, its beating, breathing, groaning truth lies below. It lies in the shaft, because the shaft does not disappear. It fills slowly, quietly, day after day, night after night, in the rhythm of 100 bodies, noble and lowborn, guest and guard obeying the pull of nature. And like all things obeyed too long, it must eventually be answered. Which is why you are standing here now, in the base of the outer wall, beside a dark opening in the stone barely large enough for a grown man to crawl through. The air is dense, clinging. The floor is packed earth, damp with a kind of ancient memory you'd rather not disturb. But disturb it you must, because today is shaft day. They don't call it that, of course. There's no name for the task that must be done, but cannot be honored. The word used in the ledgers is simple clearing, sometimes dredging, occasionally a dry euphemism, maintenance. But the men who perform it call it something else. They do not say it aloud, but they know. You step forward. The light grows thinner the deeper you go. The tunnel narrows before widening again into a low chamber beneath the castle's southern wing, a space carved directly beneath the garderobes. It is here that the shafts meet, here that waste gathers, here that time rests in its most physical form. You see the tools before you, long-handled shovels, wooden buckets with iron rings, sacks of lime, leather gloves stained dark at the palms. The stench is not immediate. The air has been sealed for weeks, but once disturbed, it will rise like something ancient and wrong. And beside the tools, the men, they are not the poorest in the castle, though close. Not slaves, not beggars, but close. Old soldiers with broken hips, widowers with no land, boys too young for arms and too hungry to say no. They do not speak as they prepare. One winds a strip of linen around his face. Another rubs tallow into his beard, a trick to dull the scent. A third fingers a talisman on a cord around his neck, not for blessing, but for bravery. No one wants to remember what waits down there, but everyone remembers what happens when it is not cleared. The last time the shaft was neglected, the stink reached the third floor. A maid fainted. A noble complained that his meat pie tasted of dampness. The steward was punished. The men were called, and the buckets returned full. So they begin again. The first man lowers himself into the shaft, rope tied at his waist, lantern hanging behind. The others wait. The seconds stretch. Then a cough echoes upward, and the work begins. You cannot look away. The bucket rises slowly, its weight shifting with the slop inside. It tips onto a sled, dragged outside the wall to the waste pit. Another follows, and another. The rhythm is ancient fill, haul, dump, lime, repeat. There is no variation, no artistry, only endurance. And yet you feel something shift, because within this horror, there is an order, a kind of dark grace. The men do not rush. They move with the certainty of those who know the job will never be finished, only paused. They do not curse. They do not speak of what they touch. They lift. They lower. They breathe through linen. And they keep going. You remember one man, years ago, who brought a flask with him, not of wine, of herbs, dried rosemary, stuffed into the neck and sealed with wax. He would hold it beneath his nose, inhaling between each lift. He said it helped him remember trees. He died 2 winters later, not from the shaft, but from a fever that spread through the lower hall. But you still think of him whenever rosemary burns. A shovel clangs against stone. A voice swears softly. Then a splash. And now the smell. It rises like smoke, but heavier. Not just filth memory. Meals eaten long ago. Illness shed in secret. Fear, wine, laughter, blood, sometimes. The very history of the castle. In liquefied form. You gag, but do not leave, because this is part of it, part of the place, part of the truth. The shaft is not separate from the throne. It lies beneath it, supports it. Every proclamation made from the dais rides atop the quiet labor of men knee-deep in muck. Every wedding danced in the great hall echoes over tunnels filled with waste. Every child born in silk sheets is carried over stone floors, washed by the same hands that carry the buckets. It is not shameful, it is structural. And yet they are never named. You ask one of the men, after the third bucket, how long he's done this. He shrugs, wipes his face, says only, long enough to know it never ends. Then he lifts another load. The shaft is nearly cleared now, the worst of it. Anyway, they will spread lime, let the air in, rest the tools, seal the tunnel again, and wait for the next time. Because there is always a next time. That night, you walk the halls differently. The privy doors seem heavier, the feasts more excessive. You watch the guests eat and drink and laugh, and you think of the chamber below, the shaft waiting patiently beneath their joy. You understand now why the men do not speak, why the task is passed down like a burden rather than a profession, why no one thanks them, and they never ask to be thanked. They do not want gratitude. They want forgetfulness and distance. But you will not forget. You will remember the smell, the sweat, the sound of waste slapping wood. You will remember the shovel against stone, the boy with the rosemary, the man who looked you in the eye and said, "It never ends." You will remember because someone must. The shaft is clean, for now, but the castle is full, the tables are heavy, the bells are ringing again, and already someone is walking to a narrow door, unaware of what lies beneath. Night falls with a hush over the stone. It is not peace, exactly not here, but a kind of solemn stillness, like a breath held too long. The castle quiets in layers, the feasting slows, the torches dim, the servants withdraw into their corners, and the halls, once so full of motion, begin to creak with the sound of memory. You walk now with no torch. You know the way, or think you do. These passages are familiar by now, the curves of them, the dips in the floor where a cart once wore down the stone, the faint ridges along the wall where fingers once traced their way in darkness. But the dark tonight feels different. It presses, not cruelly, just heavily. Beneath your feet, the walls breathe with age. The garderobes, those thin vertical veins of the keep, are silent now. No footsteps echo in the latrines. No buckets clatter. But still you hear it, the low whisper of water far below, not from a river, but from the constant slow descent of waste and time. Because even in sleep, the castle does not stop. You turn a corner, toward the old archway that leads down, far down, into the older foundation of the keep. Here, the stones are darker, not by color, but by memory. The mortar holds not just rock, but soot, bile, lime, grief. This is where the first shaft was built, before the castle grew grand, before tapestries, before towers, before glass. They still call it the chamber beneath, but no one visits, not unless they have to, not unless something breaks, or unless, like you, they want to understand. You pass a wooden beam, crooked from rot. Then the last stair, a trickle of water rain maybe, or something else slicks the last few steps. You pause, then descend. Here it is, the original shaft room. There is no grandeur to it, just a circular space, built like a forgotten well, with 4 openings in the ceiling above. You recognize them, they connect to the earliest garderobes, one on each floor. Each one is a narrow slot, no wider than a man's thigh, carved directly through the limestone. This was where it began. There are stones here no one has touched in 100 years. They weep quietly with moss. A torch bracket remains on the wall, though rusted beyond use. And in the far corner, the most telling detail of all, a forgotten pail, wooden, iron-banded, tilted on its side, half buried in filth turned soil. Someone meant to return for it. They never did. You crouch. The smell here is ancient, not foul in the same way as the working shafts. This is older. milder, the scent of decay that has stopped struggling. It is, in its own way, peaceful. And then movement. You do not panic. It is only a rat, its coat slick and dull, its tail leaving lines in the dirt. But you feel, for the first time, the exact weight of what it means to live beneath people, to exist in their shadows, their waste, their offhanded cruelty, to dwell in what they leave behind. This is where the castle's soul collects, not in the chapel, not in the throne room, but here. Because here, nothing lies. Everything that has been discarded remains. You find a stone and sit. The shaft is dry now. They must have rerouted it above, into newer chambers. But you can still see the marks on the floor from where buckets once dragged their burdens across the rock. Lines, grooves, dried flecks of something too old to name. The ghosts of labor. And you think of all the things lost here. Not just waste, but stories. A dropped ring, a child's ribbon, a scrap of parchment flushed out in shame, a broken comb, a half-eaten plum, objects with no one to mourn them. The shaft received them all. It was, in a strange way, the most honest place in the castle. The great hall held lies. The chapel held guilt. The Lord's chamber held ambitions never spoken. But the shaft it held only what people truly left behind. You run a hand along the wall. The stone is damp, but firm. You imagine the hands that placed it centuries ago, not master masons, but conscripts, builders paid little and named even less. They laid these walls in darkness, while above them, lords debated taxes and war. The ones who laid the shaft never saw the throne, but the throne sat above their work all the same. And now, long after the lords have turned to dust, the shaft remains. You close your eyes. For a moment, the world narrows to this, the hush of dripping water, the low breath of stone, the quiet ache behind your knees. Time slows here, thickens. You could stay, not out of comfort, but understanding, to remind yourself that castles do not float in clouds. They rest upon darkness, and every grandeur is paid for in silence. Eventually, you rise. You move to the center of the room, where once a man stood in a pit, shovel in hand, breathing through cloth soaked in vinegar. You imagine his thoughts, not noble, not philosophical, just survival. The rhythm of work, the weight of the bucket, the press of heat, the hope that this would be the last load of the day. Did he curse the people above, or did he forget them entirely? You don't know, you never will, because no one wrote about him. No one etched his name on the castle walls. No steward remembered. No bard sang. He was not the subject of portraits, or prayers, or regret. But he was here, and without him, the castle would have choked. That is the truth they do not tell. The shaft was not filth, it was function. And the men who emptied it, they were not scum, they were structure. You leave the chamber slowly, up the stairs, through the arch, past the cracked beam, and into the corridor where torchlight flickers again. You do not rush. You let the memory of the place stay with you, not because it is sacred, but because it is necessary. Above you, the castle still sleeps. A lady turns in her bed. A page coughs softly. Somewhere in the distance, a guard shifts his weight. None of them think, now, of what lies below. But you do. You always will. Because once you've stood beneath the chamber, once you've breathed in the hush of forgotten labor, the world above changes. Not darker, just clearer. The tapestry seems thinner, the laughter more brittle, the stone a little more honest. You reach your room, you wash your hands in cold water. The basin reflects your face older than before, not in years, in knowing. You lie down, eyes open to the ceiling beams, And before sleep comes, you whisper not a prayer, not a wish, just a name you never knew, for the man who once stood where you stood, who bore what others would not, and who vanished without a trace. The shaft still remembers him. So will you. The next morning, the castle looks the same, but you do not. You rise as you always do, with the chill of dawn still clinging to the edges of the wall. The windows are just beginning to let in the pale light of another gray morning. Fires are being stoked. Boots scrape against stone. Doors open and close. And somewhere, in a distant hallway, a bell chimes once for bread. You dress as before. The same tunic, the same belt, the same motion, but it feels like you are inhabiting your body from the outside, like a shell, a shadow, or a man carrying something no one else can see. You step out into the corridor, and the sound of your own footsteps echoes differently. You pass others, a steward adjusting his cuffs, two maids whispering over laundry, a boy chasing an apple that rolls ahead of him across the floor, and none of them look at you strangely. They do not know. Why should they? The world to them is still clean, straightforward, balanced on duty and routine. You keep walking. You pass the hallway where the royal chamber lies, its door heavy, burnished, flanked by two guards with polished spears. You do not linger. But in the edge of your vision, you see a woman exit, her gown trailing like spilled cream behind her, and a man following with downcast eyes. You wonder if they would sleep so well, if they knew what lay beneath the mattress. The castle is built on rot, but it wears its rot like perfume masked, perfumed, polite. You pass the kitchens next. Here, the heat is sharp, alive. Pies bubble. Bread darkens at the edges. Salt is thrown. Meat is carved. Water is ladled. You watch a servant rinse vegetables in a basin near the wall, and just beside that basin, almost invisible unless you know where to look, is the covered chute that leads away. Not to the shaft, not directly, but toward it. Eventually, you remember the smell. It's not here now, not with onions sizzling and flour flying, but in your mind, it lingers. You close your eyes, just for a moment, and you are back in the chamber. Stone, rope, lime, silence. You turn away. At midday, a courier arrives. He brings a scroll, sealed with wax, and you are summoned to deliver it to the record keeper. As you cross the west wing to the scribe's room, you pass a privy, just a simple door, wooden, iron latch, worn smooth from years of fingers twisting it open. It creaks slightly on its hinge. You pause. You've used this door 100 times, never thought of it, never questioned it. But now, you imagine what lies beyond it, not just the seat, not just the hole, but the drop, the descent, the slow fall into darkness, and the person who will one day carry the memory of that descent away in a pail. You keep walking, but slower. The scribe thanks you with a nod. He opens the scroll. He doesn't speak to you. You do not expect him to. But as you turn to go, you notice his fingers are stained with ink blotched at the tips, black beneath the nails, and something in you wonders if he's ever touched dirt. Real dirt, the kind that clings no matter how long you scrub. In the afternoon, you're asked to deliver a basin to the lady in the East Tower. It's silver-rimmed, polished until the inside shines like a pool of light. You carry it carefully, but the closer you get, the heavier it feels, not from weight, but from the contrast between what it reflects and what you've seen. She opens the door herself. She's young, beautiful in the way only people who have never suffered tend to be. Her hands are delicate, and when she reaches to take the basin, she does so with the faintest wrinkle in her nose, not because of you, perhaps, but because she smelled something unpleasant an hour ago and still hasn't forgiven the air. She thanks you, barely, then closes the door. You stand there for a moment, not out of offense, but out of strange, growing clarity. You know something she never will. You saw the floor of the world. You walk the battlements at dusk. The wind is cold. Flags snap in the air. Below you, the courtyard echoes with the clatter of horseshoes and the low murmurs of groomsmen preparing the stalls for night. There is smoke on the horizon cooking fires, most likely. Somewhere a dog barks. From this high, the castle looks noble, even beautiful. Its angles sharp, its towers bold, its walls clean against the purple-blue sky. You wonder how many travelers passed this way and stared in awe. How many peasants dreamed of entering these gates. How many songs were written to praise the Lord who ruled from within. But all you see is the shaft, invisible from here, unspoken, forgotten, but present. Just below that third window there, that's where the chute ends. The outer wall is stained faintly, not enough to ruin the illusion. But if you know, you can see it. You breathe. And for the first time, you realize how much of history is built on what no one wants to remember. Not the battles, not the treaties, but the filth, the rot, the men who carried it away, the hands that held the shovel, the shaft that swallowed the things nobody wanted to claim. You descend again, slower now. By the time the sun disappears, the castle is quieter. Candles flicker behind windows. Doors shut gently. The air smells of stew and wet stone. You walk past a guard changing post and nod. He nods back. He doesn't know. Not yet. That night, you use the privy. You close the wooden door. Sit, listen. You don't rush. You breathe. You think. You wait for the sound, the drop, the echo, the splash, and when it comes, you do not flinch. Because this time, you understand. And when you stand, you leave the door open for a moment longer than needed. You look down into the shaft, just a sliver of darkness. But it's enough. Enough to remember where you've been, what you've carried, what you'll always carry. Then you step back into the hall. The door closes behind you, but the weight remains. By now, you've learned not to speak of it. There are things in a castle one simply doesn't mention, not in polite company, not at the Lord's table, not even in whispers between trusted servants after the torches are put out. Waste is one of them. The shaft, another. The men who clean it. Least of all, it is not silence born from shame. It is something deeper, older. A silence built into the stone, into the very mortar between the bricks, the kind of silence that knows its place and demands you know yours. But not all things obey silence. Some creatures remember, even when men forget. You first see them again one evening, near the stables. You're carrying a bundle of worn saddlecloths when your foot slips slightly on something slick by the hay. You glance down, and there it is, darting across the shadows, a rat, gray, thin, with fur the color of wet soot and eyes like tiny drops of ink. It stops, looks up at you, and in that moment, something passes between you. Not fear, not disgust, recognition, because the rat, too, lives on what others discard. It survives by silence. It hides from light. It carries filth in its fur and secrets in its belly. And more than that, it remembers, not like a man does, not with dates or names, but with paths, smells, warm cracks in the stone, the pulse of the shaft beneath its claws. The rat scurries off, but you are left staring at the space it occupied. And you think, who knows more about the castle, the lord who gives orders, or the rat who walks unseen? Who has seen more? The rat has eaten at the foot of the throne and in the bowels of the garderobe. It has watched kings kneel and squires vomit. It has slept beside infants in cradles and beneath corpses rotting in quiet rooms where no one dares enter. The rat forgets nothing, and yet it never writes a word. You begin to see them more often now, not because there are more, but because you finally know where to look. A flicker near the tapestries in the west corridor, a tail vanishing beneath a flour sack in the pantry, a tiny shape perched behind the chapel altar, motionless as carved stone. They live in the breath between moments. They watch and wait and carry stories no man can bear to tell. It becomes a habit following them, softly, after your duties are done. You don't chase them, you don't trap them, you simply observe. One leads you behind the butchery, to a crack in the wall where grease has gathered thick as moss. Another leads you down a forgotten servant's path, past broken crates and shattered tiles, until you find yourself at the edge of an old, sealed shaft not used in years, but still breathing faintly with the ghosts of what passed through it. Here, even the air tastes like memory. You sit, once, for hours, just watching, listening, and you begin to hear things, not voices, not exactly, but impressions. The creak of old wheels, the clang of a dropped bucket, the faint hiss of someone spitting into the pit, and beneath it all, the rustle of rats moving like thoughts through the bones of the castle. You wonder, did the first stone laid in this fortress know what it would carry? Did the masons ever imagine that below the banners and heralds and stained glass windows, the true foundation would be excrement and rodents and the hush of forgotten lives? There is beauty here. It's not a beauty anyone celebrates. You will never hear a song about the rat beneath the feast table, or the man who mopped the privy shaft, or the maid who wept beside a full chamber pot. But the beauty is real, because it is honest, because it is the part of history that never lies. The rats know this. They do not judge. They do not gossip. They do not forget. You rise from the cracked floor one evening and realize that you have begun to walk differently, not with fear, not with shame, but with understanding, with reverence, even for the filth, for the layers, for the hidden world that breathes beneath every polished floorboard. And then you see it, a child, no older than 7, walking alone along the edge of the courtyard with a small wooden bowl. She looks afraid. She doesn't speak. Her eyes glance nervously toward the main keep, and then downward toward the shaft opening by the waste pit. She kneels and pours. You want to stop her, to ask what she carries, but you already know. Something someone told her to dispose of quietly. You do not interfere. Instead, you kneel beside her, say nothing. And when she's done, you help her up, dust her sleeves, and walk her back to the door. She doesn't look at you, but you know she'll remember. Not your name, not your face, but that someone saw her, that someone didn't flinch, that someone shared the silence. Because in castles, the people who deal with waste often grow invisible unless they're watched with contempt. But when they're seen with dignity, something changes. Not in the castle, in the soul. That night, you feed a rat. Not because you should, but because it feels right. You leave a crust of bread on the outer ledge of the shaft and wait. Minutes pass, then a small paw, a flicker of motion, the bread disappears. And in that moment, something sacred passes between you again. It is not friendship. It is not grace. It is understanding, quiet, raw, eternal. The rat has eaten what you gave. It will remember. It will pass beneath the stone with your scent in its fur. And it will carry your presence into places you will never see. Beneath the kitchens, beneath the chapel, beneath the Lord's own throne. You watch the dark, and you smile. Not because it is joyful, but because it is true. Because for all the poetry of towers and the glory of knights and the speeches of kings, the castle's most honest stories live in its waste. and crawl through its cracks, and curl up behind its firewood, twitching their ears, cleaning their paws, and remembering what no historian ever writes down. Let them forget. The rats will remember. So will you. It is strange, isn't it, how castles are remembered, centuries from now, when the walls have cracked and the banners have turned to dust, when the names of the lords are forgotten, and the wars they fought are buried beneath footnotes. In forgotten manuscripts, the castle will remain. Not entirely, of course. Stone erodes, wood rots, roofs collapse, but something in it endures, as if the shape of the place was carved into memory more firmly than into earth. Tourists will come. Scholars too. They will walk the ramparts and marvel at the arrow loops. They'll sketch the crumbling arches, run their fingers along moss-covered stones, and say words like fortification, medieval, prestige. They will stand in the great hall and try to imagine what feasts once thundered there, what kings once raised goblets beneath chandeliers of bone. But they will not speak of the waste. The shaft will still be there, perhaps walled off, perhaps collapsed. But some part of it, the drop, the echo, the architecture of excretion, will endure beneath their boots. And though they will not see it, and most will not know it, the truth will sit there, waiting. The castle was built not only for glory, but for release, for digestion, for the human body and its inescapable cycles, for the necessary things. And you think, isn't that more permanent? In the end, the scrolls decay, the names are lost, the laws rewritten, but the stink, the stain, the slow rot that trickled from noble bellies down stone pipes into darkness, that stays. That leaves marks not only in the stone, but in the structure of the place, in how rooms are arranged, in where servants are allowed to tread, in the incline of the floor beneath a throne, so no waste ever flows the wrong way. The castle, for all its pride, was built to manage filth, and it never stopped. You walk again tonight, not as a servant, not as a ghost, but as something in between, a witness. The air is cold, not cruel. The moon hangs above like a polished plate. Shadows stretch long across the courtyard, and you pass them silently, nodding at no one, speaking to no one, listening for what the night remembers. You find yourself tracing paths you've walked before, past the baker's window, past the old well, toward the outer wall where the shaft empties still, though no one speaks of it anymore. And you wonder who else walked this way. 100 years ago, was there another like you, a servant who saw too much, a maid who followed rats into silence, a boy who once lowered the bucket and never looked at the castle the same again? You think there must have been. There always is. Every generation buries someone beneath the narrative, someone who saw the truth, carried the stink, touched the underside of history, and still returned with grace instead of anger. You sit beneath the window. It's quiet. The air smells of old wood, faint ash, and something else not rot, not quite but memory. You pull your cloak tighter, but not against the cold, against the weight of knowing. You know where the pipes run now. You know what lies beneath the floor of the priest's chamber. You know why that far eastern tower is slightly tilted, and how the privy in the guard quarters drains 3 inches slower after the rain. You know that beneath every act of nobility lies a mechanism built to carry away what nobility leaves behind. And the castle knows, you know. It doesn't resist. It doesn't hide. It simply stands as it always has, proud, solemn, slightly stained at the edges, the same way a nobleman's cloak will trail mud, no matter how high he holds his chin. You begin to write, not in ink, not on paper, but in thought, in memory, in the rhythm of your walk. Each step is a record, each pause, a footnote. You begin to map the castle in your mind, not by its towers and gates, but by its drains, its ducts, its unspeakable paths. The real history, the one that no lord ever requested in a chronicle, the one the rats carry forward, footfall by footfall, without fanfare. And then you think about your own waste. Your body, like everybody, contributes. It has, for years, quietly released its weight into the shaft, into the pit, into the belly of the place. And one day, long after you're gone, someone might excavate that layer of earth, find the traces of what you left. Not a name, not a signature, but something more honest, something chemical, something irrefutable. A piece of you will remain, just as the waste of kings remains, equal at last. Perhaps that's why the shaft feels sacred now, because it is the one place in the castle where all are the same, where the prince's meal and the stable boy's crust pass through the same gate, descend into the same dark, join in the same slow return to earth. It is democracy by digestion, communion by decay. No one is remembered there, and no one is forgotten. You rise, your joints ache slightly, not from age, but from carrying a truth that no one else wants. And yet, you don't regret it. Not anymore. Because the shaft taught you that knowledge doesn't need applause. It needs respect. It needs to be carried, like a bucket, without spilling, without complaint. As you turn to leave, you glance once more at the edge of the shaft, and then movement. A rat, familiar, perhaps, or maybe just another of the 1,000 little monks who chant history with their tiny, filthy feet. It pauses, looks at you, sniffs. You nod, because yes, you remember too. The rat vanishes, and you begin to walk. You pass a boy polishing armor, unaware that the gleam he toils over once hung inches above the worst stench a man could ever breathe. You pass a maid lighting candles, unaware that beneath her feet lies a duct no saint ever blessed. You pass a noble laughing in a corridor, wine in hand, perfume thick, never wondering where his dinner will go when his belly is done with it. You keep walking, because now you know, and the castle, whether it realizes or not, belongs more to you than to any of them. Not because you own it, but because you understand it. You've seen what they refuse to look at. You've touched what they pretend does not exist. You've walked the paths between the stones and felt the heartbeat of a place that pulses not with glory, but with necessity. That is the real life of the castle, and you carry it with every step. There comes a day when you leave the castle, not by force, not in shame, not with ceremony. You simply walk away. A new lord arrives younger, sharper, hungrier for marble and mirrors than for the low hum of old stones. He brings his own servants. They speak a different dialect. They wear cleaner aprons. They ask questions you've long since stopped answering. It is not hostility that replaces you. It is ignorance. A soft, well-scented ignorance that smiles and gestures and renovates the garderobe without ever asking where the shaft begins or where it ends. So you go? You pack no bags. You take nothing. Not because you have nothing, but because everything that matters, you already carry. You walk past the chapel, now painted over in bright lime wash. You walk past the shaft's mouth, now covered by a perfumed slab of wood. And you pause, just briefly, not to say goodbye. That would be foolish. The shaft has no ears, or rather, it has too many. But you pause anyway to acknowledge, because you know now you can leave the shaft, but it never truly leaves you. It stays in your feet, in how they find balance on uneven stone. It lingers in your fingers, in how they test the weight of silence before speaking. It curls at the edge of your breath, when the world tries too hard to smell only of roses. And most of all, it sharpens your eyes so that wherever you go, you see what others miss. A crack in the monastery wall that leaks during storm. The slope of a chamber floor that carries liquid just so. The uneaten crust tucked in the corner of a merchant's hall, forgotten not by accident, but by instinct. You see it all, and though you don't speak of it often, you hold it, gently. Like a candle, you're not sure anyone else can bear to see lit. Years pass. You live elsewhere now, a small cottage near the edge of a field. It has no shaft, just a pit dug deep enough to satisfy the village and shallow enough to forget by spring. You tend your garden. You greet neighbors. You age slowly, without pride and without scandal. But some nights, the shaft returns. Not as a ghost. It is not cruel like that. It comes as a memory with smell, with shape, with warmth. You remember the thick air of the lower corridors, the wooden bucket with its damp rope, the sound of something falling, not hard but softly, like an echo made of cloth and grief. You remember the rat. You remember the girl with the bowl. You remember the day you learned to walk without shame, even if the ground beneath you was soaked in centuries of it. And you wonder quietly, always quietly, whether the shaft was not a place of filth at all, but of truth. A place where everything that pretended to be clean could finally let go. A place where everyone noble, poor, silent, cruel became, at last, equal, not by law, not by love, but by function, by biology, by inevitability. And perhaps, in that strange sacredness, the shaft was more honest than any altar. You write letters sometimes, never to be sent, just folded and placed beneath a stone near the threshold of your garden. You write about what you saw, not to confess, not to complain, but to remember, to acknowledge that, for a time, you were the only one who saw the whole castle, not just its height, but its depth. And that you were not disgusted. You were, in your own quiet way, grateful. Because once you see the shaft, and do not turn away, you begin to see everything more clearly. People, patterns, histories. You begin to understand that no kingdom rises without a pit to carry its waste. And no story worth trusting avoids the parts that stink. One spring morning, you find a small rat curled beside your garden wall. It is old, its fur patchy, one eye closed. It breathes slow, but still. You leave a crumb, not for friendship. You've long since let go of such projections. You leave it because some things must be remembered, because some stories are not written in ink, but in gesture, in kindness given without demand, in silence shared with a creature no one asked to notice. That night, you dream of the shaft. It is colder than you remember, quieter, but not empty. It is filled with flickers, not of light, but of presence. As if everyone who ever bent over its edge now waits there, not trapped, but resting, not punished, but preserved. The dream offers no fear, no stink, only stillness. And you wake with your heart softened, because you realize you were never alone down there, not truly, even in the darkest hour as the bucket lowered, as the rat scurried, as the night pressed inward. Something in that place held you, accepted you, refused to look away. The shaft never judged. It simply received, and that, perhaps, is what you needed all along. Years later, when your body finally quiets and you lie in the kind of silence no stone can echo, someone will clear your cottage. Someone will gather your things simple, clean, unremarkable, and perhaps, if they are curious, they will lift that one particular stone near the threshold, and they will find a folded piece of parchment, and they will read, "I lived in a castle once. I saw where the waste went, and I learned that truth is not clean, but it is real." And if you carry it gently, it will carry you back. That will be enough. They will not understand, not entirely, but they will remember that someone saw more than towers, that someone chose to look down not in shame, but in wonder. And somewhere, under another castle, in another time, a rat will pause, sniff the air, and scurry into the dark. And the shaft will remember you, even if no one else does. Even if the world turns again and forgets your name, the shaft will still be there, waiting, still open, still honest, still echoing with the hush of everything we pretend not to be. Let the others sleep to stories of kings. You will sleep to this. You've walked far enough tonight. Let the floorboards hold the rest. And if you're still awake, was it a little easier this time?